Here in Minnesota, the 508 bee species that we have, worldwide we have 20,000 bee species. They each have, life history strategies that are so unique and different that kind of affect population size and things which we don't even understand. My name is Marissa Chase. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the Caribou Native Bee Lab. So I mainly work on a research project of my own, but I help out with other different projects. And so I mainly do research here in the lab. Yeah, so the Bee Lab at the University of Minnesota has two different research groups. So we have a honeybee lab that's run by Dr. Marissa Chase, and so that's one research group, and then we have another native bee lab run by Dr. Dan Caravo. And then we also have the Bee Squad, which kind of does all of our outreach for both honeybees and native bees here in the state, and they also maintain a lot of different honeybee hives across the state. They do a lot of great work. In North America, we have 4,000 species of native bees, and when I say native, they evolved and are native to this area, right? And that distinguishes them from a honeybee, right? Apis mellifera, which is not native here, and if we're talking about Minnesota or just the United States in general. And so people also distinguish between managed and not managed bees. Honeybees are managed for crop pollination, and we do have some solitary bees that are also managed for pollination, or native bees that are managed for pollination, so some bumblebee species, right, for tomatoes. But most of our native bees are solitary, and that means that they do not have the different castes. They don't have a colony that they're a part of. So this means that the female bee, she is on her own and she is foraging. So she emerges in the spring or the summer, and she forages from a lot of different floral resources, and at that time she's collecting both pollen and nectar to bring back to a nest that she totally constructs herself. So whether that's in the ground or a cavity above ground, and she kind of forms those resources into sometimes what's called a pollen loaf. It's very cute, or sometimes those provisions are also more liquid, so it doesn't really fit that loaf sort of description. But she leaves those resources behind, and she lays an egg, and she closes up that brood cell. And she might lay several more eggs in the nest, but then once she's done, she closes up that nest and then leaves and dies for that season. And those bees are on their own to develop and then emerge the following season. These native bees are only active as adults on the landscapes for very narrow windows of time, so like 4 to 6 weeks for a species as adults. Whereas, you take a social bee like the honeybee, and you have kind of honeybees across the growing season. But these solitary bee species occupy much narrower windows on the landscape. Because native bees have not been studied as long as, let's say honeybees and other insects, other pollinators, we don't necessarily have as much data to kind of look back at historically. There's a lot of information more recent information about which bee species are declining. Sort of, you can think about it as like the winners and losers of, when they're faced with climate change and habitat loss and sort of all of that. But there are some bees that are just naturally more rare, and that has to do with maybe they are specialists and their specific host plant isn't as abundant, or other life history traits that those bees have. But one thing that we discuss a lot is when we're looking for these rare bees, they're out and foraging on maybe their preferred floral host, and we're sitting at that floral host trying to find them. But maybe at that time period, that bee is really inside its nest, it's laying eggs, it's actually creating the pollen loaf that it leaves behind for its progeny. And so how long are those bees actually staying in the nest and not foraging? Do they forage all at once? Are they going back and forth? I mean, we just don't know. And so that's why we're doing a lot of these like targeted survey efforts to try to figure that out, because we know which host plants they prefer, and now we can kind of track them. native bees are important just because, right, we have such a diversity of native bees, but it's important to conserve their diversity for the sake of their existence. But we also know that native bees and native plants have co-evolved together. And when I talk about that coevolution, that means we're talking about native bees know how to pollinate native plants specifically. They're synced up in terms of phenology. I talked about that sort of native bees are out foraging as adults in that narrow 4 to 6 week window. And so that means that native plants and native bees are sort of synced up and they are dependent on each other. So those native plants are dependent on bees for pollination, and the bees are dependent on those plants for floral resources. So the nectar, the pollen, and sometimes floral oils. And sometimes these relationships are so co-evolved that some bee species only pollinate one species of plants, and it depends on those specific proteins in the pollen or the sugar concentration in the nectar. So you have really highly specialized bees, and you also have generalist bees that forage from a wide variety of native plants and just floral resources in general. But then you also have bees in between, so bees that might specialize on a family of plants or maybe a few different genera and whatnot. So you do have this sort of wide spectrum of specialization in bees. But really, the native plants and native bees are so crucial for each other. But two, when we're considering all of those pollination services that native bees offer to native plants, so animal pollination is responsible for and benefits 90% of flowering plants. And when I talk about animal pollination, it's really insects, and when we talk about insect pollination, it's a lot of that. The majority is bees kind of doing that work. But we also know that bees are responsible for, there's that statistic, 1 out of every 3 bites of food you eat. So not just the wild plants, but also the crops that we depend on for food and food security and all of that. But I think there's a common question that we get, which is okay, but we have 20,000 species of bees worldwide. If some are declining, or some may be extirpated from an area or go extinct, we have all these other bee species that can kind of make up for that pollination. But really, there's this recent study published in 2022 that looked at how much do rare bees or declining bees contribute to crop pollination and wild plant pollination, and they found that they're actually really crucial. So all these bees that may not be that abundant on the landscape still matter for crop pollination and still matter for wildflower pollination. And so you need all of that diversity of bees to actually pollinate all of the resources we have. And so I found that really interesting because I think a lot of the time we might focus on a few different species of bees that are useful for crop pollination, but it's really all of them that matter and really maintain ecosystem functioning and all of those pollination services. So one of our main questions that we try to tackle in the lab is how native bees are affected by restoration and management. And so we know that habitat loss, is a major driver of bee declines. A lot of those management operations and restorations are really, floral focused, flower focused, restoring plant composition, but we don't necessarily understand how those efforts affect native bees in the wild bee community. And so if we can kind of figure out, well, what's the main factor that affects bee diversity and abundance? Is it really the planting size? If the size of the restoration is in an area with maybe a lot of natural surrounding habitat that's intact, well, maybe we can use a lower cost seed mix. And so that's one of sort of our areas of focus in the Bee Lab. Leads me into what I'm working on in the lab. We have just a wealth of bee data that we've collected through all these research projects, and the Minnesota DNR has a ton of bee specimens too. And so what that allows us to do is, we have over 100,000 bee specimens, so we can really ask very direct, kind of specific, hypothesis-driven questions about bee biology and bee life history. And so one particular question that I'm interested in tackling is how soil sand content and host plant distribution affects rare and specialist bees. And so we're using purple prairie clover as our study species because, one, it's really abundant sort of across the state, both in restorations and in remnants. But also it has a lot of bees that specialize on its pollen. So they need that pollen in order to feed their progeny and lay eggs and all of that. But despite Dahlia purpurea being so common, purple prairie clover, these bees are really rare. And so we're trying to figure out why that is. And the reason we think that is because potentially, those soil conditions. So maybe these bees are in fact sand specialists. And that would mean that if we, go to a site and there's Dahlia purpurea, there's purple prairie clover, and it's also in a sandy area, maybe we're more likely to find those rare bees than if we were in sort of more of like a clay loam type of soil where purple prairie clover was growing. And this is really important because, it can inform restoration efforts and management efforts because, if we're only thinking about restoring the floral community and we're not paying attention to the soil conditions, then maybe we're really not restoring the bee community and actually, considering those more rare and kind of specialist bee species. So we're talking about providing floral resources throughout the growing season. And the way to accomplish this is obviously to plant native plants that will be successful in their native area. Because these native plants are used to the growing conditions that exist within your area, they will more likely be able to thrive in this environment and be really good resources for bees. But there are other considerations too, just besides floral resources. So things like making sure bees have adequate nesting conditions can be really beneficial to support bees in your garden. So we know that bees are central place foragers. So this means that they nest close to floral resources. So whether that's their preferred floral resources or they're just generalists and they are going to construct their nest just close to abundant floral resources. So that means that if your garden does not have good nesting habitat, they really won't forage from that area. There's many different ways that you can kind of construct nesting habitat, but what I like to recommend to people is just having varied sort of soil conditions. So making sure you leave patches of bare ground, making sure that you maintain your leaf litter kind of during early spring, sort of provide a blanket for bees nesting in the ground. Sometimes people will say that a sort of a messy garden can be sort of the best thing for bees. And I think in terms of providing nesting habitat, that can really be true. And then other ways to support bees is to really collect your own data. So we always recommend that folks use apps like iNaturalist to upload bee photos, upload photos of bees using different plant resources. We also, in the Native Bee Lab, I mentioned we have the Bee Squad, which does a lot of outreach, and we have a lot of different outreach programs that folks can join to collect their own data. So we have the Bumble Bee Atlas. You can adopt a grid within Minnesota and actually go and look for bumblebees and record them. And we have this new project called NestQuest. It's really fun. It's folks can volunteer and go out and actually look for bumblebee nests. And so all of that, like helping collect data, citizen science projects is really important for bees and bee research, and something that we're always looking for more volunteers. So definitely we post these opportunities on our websites and kind of social media accounts. So yeah, this is definitely a good way to help.